Now, I'd like to introduce you to Taylor Robinson, PLG Consulting's president and moderator for this event. Taylor?
Yes, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at. On behalf of the PLG team, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our discussion on the current and future truck market and sharing some of the best ways for shippers to be successful in this challenging marketplace. Firstly, I'd like to share a bit about PLG Consulting. We are a premier North American logistics and supply chain consulting firm. We've been around for over 17 years and have served clients, over 200 clients in the shipper, carrier, and private equity markets. Our team of real-world industry veterans bring practical solutions to our clients, and we have experts in all modes of surface transportation. Today's webinar will focus on the difficult challenges in the truck freight market. There are a multitude of trucking markets and niches. Today, we'll focus on the issues that are quite common to all the truck markets. Okay, on today's call, we have two terrific panelists. Go to the next slide. First, Mike Muchik has over 25 years experience in a variety of transportation, warehousing, and logistics operations with companies like Excel Logistics, Nippon Express, and Menlo Worldwide. Mike has been providing strategic and operational consulting since 2014. Also, we have John Gilbert, who has over 25 years in the transportation and supply chain industries. He started his career in sales at A. Dewey Pyle, a preeminent Northeastern U.S. LTL, truckload, and special services provider. Post-MBA, John took on a series of roles in corporate transportation and supply chain management. He started consulting with a deep focus on transportation and logistics in 2003 and has been a part of PLG team for the past 3 years. Okay, here is today's agenda. First, we'll review the most important issues in today's truck freight market. Then we will discuss the impact this year and beyond. And then next, we will share our insights and best practices for shippers in today's market. And after we conclude the presentation, we'll take questions from our audience. Please send your questions at any time throughout the presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mike Muchik, and he can get started.
Thank you, Taylor, and welcome everyone. Today's webinar is timely as the truck market is driving into strong headwinds. We're going to look at some of the key factors that are impacting the industry: driver supply and freight demand, regulations and the impact they're having on the industry, inflationary trucking costs, and disruption and innovation. Next slide. If we look at the issues chart facing the trucking industry, we see driver shortage, driver retention, and hours of service forming a waterfall. They represent the top 10 issues for the past 11 years. The ELD mandate, which went into effect April 1st, forms its own waterfall and has been a top 10 issue for the past 7 years. If we look at this, our takeaway is that these issues have experienced a long road without strong solutions. And 2018 will be critical to solving these issues. Next slide. Drivers are part of the overall labor market, which is challenged. As you can see, over the past 7 years, the labor market in the USA has been shrinking. 2018, employment sits at 4.1%. Accompanying the information is that GMP has been increasing for the past several years by 3%. This translates to increasing the amount of freight being shipped. The takeaway here is that more freight is in demand and less supply of the labor market is being used to move the freight. Next slide. Let's zoom in on the driver supply. We are expected to have a driver shortage in 2018 The shortage is forecasted to continue for at least the next 8 years if something doesn't change. Some of the key components of the shortage are aging driver workforce resulting in retirement, regulations and compliance pushing drivers out, and lifestyle changes where drivers are just leaving the industry altogether. This truck driver shortage, starting in 2018, about 60,000 driver shortage, is expected to continue up to 160,000 driver shortage in 2026. Next, we can look at driver turnover, which is really the big elephant in the room. If you remember one of our first charts, there was an issue called driver retention. Driver retention is really driver turnover. If we look at just the last couple of years, the chart we see big fleet and small fleet truckload turnover from 2016 to 2017 is 64 to 95%. At 95% turnover, the company is basically turning over all of their drivers on an annual basis. This is not sustainable for any company, especially when the industry needs 240,000 drivers by the year 2020. Next slide. How do we retain the drivers and why are they leaving? For an industry to change the 90% plus turnover, the driving experience must change. Today, the young person needed to replace the retiring driver may not be interested in the driver experience as it exists today. Sleeping in a truck, waiting in long lines, eating their meals in a gas station, being treated as the lowest person in the chain of command, being away from home for long periods of time. That mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion of the trucker's life of today is just not appealing to the young worker. Next. Next slide.
Mike, I've moved it. I don't know if you can see it.
Nope. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So when we look at this slide, we could say this is a disruption slide. Improve the pay and the drivers will stay. On the left-hand side, the left corner of the chart, the entry pay for drivers is $48,000. This calculates roughly to $16 per hour, using 2,300 miles per month at 50 miles per hour. At $16 per hour, a driver may decide a career with Uber may be more attractive. They can be home every night with their family. If you look on the right side of the chart, where it says retention, that's really the disruption factor, where wages really need to get from $48,000 on the left to closer to the $100,000 on the right, or maybe the true answer is somewhere in between. Next.
Mike, there's a little delay on what you're seeing. The rest of us are seeing it move.
Oh, okay. The next slide would be capacity crunch. Further evidence of loads to one driver, and is currently at 7.4 loads to one driver, which is equal to last year's peak season level. As a comparison, March of 2017, the load to truck ratio was 3.2 to 1, and in March 2016, the load to truck ratio was 1.6 to 1. Something needs to change dramatically to alleviate the capacity crunch in the market. At these rates, by this year's peak season, it'll be a very, very tough market to move freight. Next. Finally, the ELD mandate, or what I call the government trying to help. The ELD mandate went into effect on April 1st of 2018. There are multiple areas where this could impact your business. This could result in delayed shipments, worker overtime, dock parking issues, chargebacks, and definitely productivity drops both on the over-the-road driver side and in workers in the distribution center. Now is the time to start thinking about how you might handle issues as the ELD mandate plays out over the next 30 to 90 days. Next. Earlier, I mentioned headwinds facing the trucking industry. I would like to discuss some of those challenges here. As you note in the pie chart, driver pay is listed as 38% of total expenses, and the pay results in turnover of anywhere from 63 to 95% over the last 3 years. Pay will need to be increased, so the 38% of total truck expenses will need to go up. Healthcare, which is 17% of trucking expenses, is definitely going to go up this year, as it does in every other industry in America. Fuel is 13% of the cost. This year, fuel has gone up 50 cents a gallon compared to the fuel costs in 2017. So we can expect fuel as a percentage of trucking expenses to go up as well. This week, oil spiked to the highest price since 2014. The takeaway here is we have inflationary markers that we can see that inflation is on its way in 2018 and beyond. Disruption and innovation. The marketplace is a great place for disruption. Sometimes market players bring disruption through innovation, and sometimes events drive disruption in the marketplace. Event-driven disruption, like the 27 hurricane, can drive the price up through high freight demand and low driver supply. We saw that happen last year. An example of technology-driven disruption might be a brokerage app that allows for load matching with low fees, such as XPO Connect, Uber Freight, Transfix, or Convoy. When this happens, the broker fees become lower, and sometimes those funds can be used to be diverted for driver pay. Further evidence of positive disruption is Amazon. More companies can learn from Amazon disruption. They use creativity and innovation to get the job done. A to Z, as it says in the logo, and you're done. Remember when everyone thought they sold books? They turned logistics upside down. The issues in trucking have not impacted them. The question to be asked, what can we learn from Amazon in the marketplace today to address some of the issues that many of the shippers and carriers are facing? Disruption can be a beautiful thing. And finally, impact in 28 and beyond. Some of the highlights: freight demand will continue to rise. It's a hot market. Trucking costs will rise 8 to 10%, with the spot market rising even higher. Covering loads will be a challenge. If there's no change to driving the supply up, this will be even more challenging come the peak season. Driver pay, as we talked about earlier, will need to rise significantly, or it will be a very tight market to provide drivers to the high freight demand. Inflationary times, we illustrated the markers that are out there. 2018 will definitely see inflation on the rise. And then finally, ELD. Be prepared for what the outcomes will show in the next 30 to 90 days. It will impact both shippers and carriers in the marketplace. What can we do? John Gilbert will now share ideas to address today's challenges. John?
Thank you, Mike. When we think about how to proceed in these types of situations, what we really think about is getting back to the fundamentals. Next slide, please. And it's really all about execution and figuring out how to manage all the issues that come up day to day, but doing that in a way that's structured with a strong process. So the fundamentals still apply. A blogger that I love to follow, and maybe you should too, is Seth Godin. And a recent post of his was, "Can we talk about the process first?" I'd recommend you look it up. But Seth talked about the idea that when unexpected things happen, sticking to the process is really the right path. And so if the process isn't working, instead of running in crisis mode or trying to make things happen in ways that are probably unusual and don't work to your strengths, fix the process. And so we believe that even in these difficult markets, procurement fundamentals still apply. And that means managing your transportation spend with a rigorous approach. And best practices include using proven category management tools. And that means understanding stakeholder requirements in detail and having ongoing discussions with inside and external stakeholders, making sure that you understand your current state capabilities, what gaps exist according to your stakeholders and others, and finding new opportunities. Using a robust data set and making sure that you have a good handle on all of the data that helps you to run your business. We recommend gathering market intelligence and using benchmarks. So getting out there, we use DAT from TransCore. We get data from freight audit and payment providers and shippers and other sources like that and aggregate that together. And you should be looking at those things too. And finally, I think having a strong understanding of the competitive forces, who's out there in the industry and what alternatives you have is really crucial to success. I believe that alternatives are really the way in which we can retain power even when we're challenged like in the current market. Next slide, please. So when we think about logistics process, one of the big questions is how much of the process should we own internally and how much should fall with other players? And so this slide is an exhibit that shows the continuum from fully insourced all the way to fully outsourced in the logistics process. And so some of the things that you can do are use outside carriers. Some companies run their own trucks. You could outsource freight to common carriers or other types of providers. You can put settlement and routing out and have other parties do that. You can outsource the TMS. We have a surprising number of shippers that work with PLG that still don't have TMS. And frankly, there's a lot of resources out there that are not that difficult to implement, that can be brought to you by third parties and probably don't even require huge amounts of effort in the IT area because they can be integrated quickly and easily from cloud type solutions. So going on, you can go all the way to outsourcing everything right to the DC. And so I think thinking about where your strengths are and how to build capability where you need it internally and figuring out the right way to get it externally is crucial to success in this type of business. For transportation, controlling costs requires thinking about things that go beyond rate itself. And so when we talk about transportation, one of the things that comes up is that there are drivers of costs that go into the areas of intensity and volume. And so if you think about intensity in transportation, that has to do with distances shipped. It has to do with how consolidated your volume is and what types of modes you use. It also deals with speed. So if you can reduce your use of expedites or figure out how to reduce and consolidate shipments and run in different modes, moving from parcel to LTL or LTL to truckload, then you have opportunities to greatly reduce cost. On volume, we look at opportunities to optimize the network. We also think that looking into excess packaging and reducing product content in terms of size and scale is also another way to save cost ultimately in logistics. So a lot of times our clients are strictly focused on rates, but we find that there are often opportunities that outstrip the rate savings potential in those two areas. Ultimately, you want to be able to control costs through the whole management of the entire process. And depending upon your business conditions, the market, and your freight characteristics, one or more of these may be the area that where you should be concentrating most intensively. When you do ultimately decide to go and get rates and manage rates, we think that it's crucially important, especially in this moment, to broaden your carrier base if you don't have sufficient depth of carriers. The size of your business, your unique needs, and the ability to manage carriers are all part of the equation that helps you to determine how many carriers you need. But we see many, many shippers that have too few carriers, and when the market tightens, they don't have sufficient relationships to rely upon to try and move loads that perhaps can't be handled by the existing carrier base. Carrier selection, you should include providers that are diverse in their geography. So not just national or regional players, but also potentially local truckers, and looking at diversity in their focus and business model too. So having a variety means that you have more options and more different points of view when it comes time to find new ways to handle your capacity. Carrier management costs have come down a lot in recent years, especially with some of these new breed TMSs, and also through the use of intermediaries like brokers. And so we believe that having more carriers is feasible today when it might not have been so easy a few years back. And we think that running a proper program in this market can require 4 or more selected truckload carriers in each shipping location at least, plus brokers. And we think that brokers offer services beyond just filling in gaps in capacity. So think about your broker, and there may be ways to use them for ongoing moves and regular moves beyond just using them in crisis to cover loads that your regular asset-owning carriers can't handle. In terms of determining when to bid, we're strong believers in running regular bidding cycles. We have many shippers that we deal with who put off carriers. They don't want to talk about rate increases. The rep will call and say, we need to talk about price. And their response is, well, we're not ready to have that conversation, things like that. But doing that puts you at risk in terms of capacity. And we really believe that ultimately you're going to have to pay something close to market price. And being proactive about that, we think results in much better outcomes than waiting until the last possible moment to go to bid. And again, benchmarking is a really great way to test market. One thing about bidding is that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. You might look at lanes where you're having trouble and consider putting those out as a market test and seeing what happens instead of just doing your entire business all the time. In terms of building sustainable capacity for your long-term success, there are at least 4 areas where we think you should be spending your time. The first is leverage resources to find capacity. And so carrier capacity can come in the form of 3PLs and brokers, asset-owning carriers. But a lot of the clients that we work with don't necessarily think about dedicated or private fleet solutions. And certain times, dedicated can be very interesting. Also, private fleet might be either something that you operate or talking to other shippers that are co-located or near your facilities and utilizing front haul or back haul capacity on private fleets can be another way to find. So we think that that's a really useful tool. And talk to consultants. Consultants oftentimes have lists of carriers, understand who's out there in the market, and have ways to uncover capacity you might not necessarily know about or have access to. Employing the best-in-class technology is really crucial. And so TMS, taking advantage of big data and analytics and being able to track and show expense and volume numbers quickly and figure out where problems are occurring is really crucial to success. We have a lot of clients that have not optimized their networks in a very long period of time. Some never. And we find many, many opportunities for savings and reduction in carrier usage, which allows for additional capacity to be redeployed elsewhere through optimization efforts. Most of that seems to be in interbranch shipping, either from plants to distribution centers or from DC to DC. And the last thing in technology is we think you should be looking at emerging technologies like blockchain. And there's lots and lots of talk about that today. I'm not suggesting necessarily that you implement right now, but getting ready for that and understanding what its powers might be could be a good way to ensure that you're prepared for the future. In putting in a proper audit and payment program is another. We get many complaints from carriers that shippers take a very long time to pay, and you should pay through your TMS if you have one. Lots of modern shippers are now sending invoices to their carriers and saying, hey, if this invoice is correct, we'll remit the funds just to prove the invoice that we've created for you out of the TMS. That can be very powerful and simple. If you can't do that, we think that using a qualified freight audit and payment provider external is really helpful. And again, what's nice about those relationships is they can give you insights in terms of benchmarking and process improvement, and also much better data for preparing for future bids. And we also advocate the use of post-auditors for additional review of your freight audit practices to make sure that you're, in fact, paying the correct amounts and not double paying invoices. Lastly, we're strong believers in paying freight bills as quickly as possible and allowing carriers to decide when they want to get paid. Rates are not the only determinant of customer desirability, and cost of capital for carriers is often much higher than it is for shippers. Early pay discounts are one way to deal with that. So we have clients that have put in programs where we pay you within 15 days for a 1% discount or things like that. So there are ways to actually monetize that and become a more desirable shipper. We really believe that being the shipper that carriers want to work with is one of the big keys to getting capacity. And paying the bills is one piece, but also getting drivers in and out quickly and other things like that are really important in terms of maintaining good carrier relationships and being the first choice when you call with a potential pickup. Next slide. So what we say here is that process is always crucial. Even in times of crisis, you shouldn't abandon the process. Instead, you should create new ways to use those and ensure that you have the right way to handle things that come up along the way using the assigned process instead of just jumping in and trying to firefight. Consider all of your resource options and make sure that you know who's out there that can potentially help you that goes beyond just the traditional people who you've dealt with in the past. You should source regularly to find capacity and manage rates and make sure that you're out there in the market proactively instead of waiting to the last minute to run bids. Don't forget about non-price drivers of cost. So volume and intensity are just as important as rate. And finally, grow your team and invest in tools to build capability. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to hand it back over to Taylor for questions and answers.
Great, thank you, Mike and John. PLG has been serving shippers and other clients since 2001, and many times our projects focus on lowering their cost and improving their efficiency. PLG's most popular engagements are logistics diagnostic assessments, with some focusing on trucking. So if there's any way that we can help you, if you're a shipper in this area, please let us know. My contact information here is on the next Q&A slide here. So please don't hesitate to give me a call or send me an email. With that, I'd like to proceed to the Q&A session. Got a couple questions in so far. Let's start out with a historical question here for John and Mike. In your careers, have you seen any other truck market conditions similar to the current? And if so, what happened to resolve those issues? So John, you want to go first on that?
Sure. Well, I remember back in my LTL days, a time when UPS threatened to go on strike, and another instance when the unionized Northeastern, or perhaps national, Teamster carriers went on strike. And since I worked for a non-union carrier, we had many phone calls from shippers that had not established business relationships with us prior to the crisis. And the only responsible thing that we could do to make sure that we could continue to handle our existing accounts was to basically say to clients that we didn't have a relationship with that we couldn't give them capacity. And so that goes back to this idea of having a very broad carrier base from a shipper's perspective to make sure that you have lots of options when these kinds of crises occur. The strike did not last a particularly long amount of time. I believe it was perhaps less than a week. And so it did resolve itself. It wasn't exactly like this in that instance. But I do believe that maintaining lots of relationships is insurance against getting pinched when these kinds of market conditions occur. Mike, your thoughts?
I think and that's a great anecdote there, John. I think the thing that comes closest, but not the same duration, would be what happened at the Port of LA and Long Beach when they weren't taking in any of the ships, and then all of a sudden everything came in at one time, and that really drove the capacity to a point where there wasn't enough trucks to handle all the freight, and so then that spiked both the price and it didn't have enough capacity to move it because people didn't want to put everything on the rail because there wasn't enough time to get everything out because they had waited so long for the freight to get here. That dissipated, I would say within 60 days or so. But that would be I think the closest thing that we've seen to what we're facing today.
Okay, Mike, what could slow down or stop the inflationary environment in trucking, in your opinion?
Probably the way things are headed right now that are driving all the inflationary costs up. I think the biggest force that probably could slow things down would be a recession. I believe that's probably about the only thing that's going to turn something back in the other direction.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, that would be, yeah.
Okay, we have a question around these potential trade wars that have sprung up here in very recent times. What is the impact on the truck market that may happen? John or Mike or both of you, any thoughts on that?
This is Mike. I could take that on. This is just my opinion, but let's just take the trade war that potentially could go on with China. It's my belief that the trade war won't necessarily have an impact on the amount of freight, but it could have an impact on the mode in which it it gets transported. So from that aspect, perhaps you could see a shift in mode. So it might take some away from air and put it to ocean, and then from ocean it might see more on the rail. So I think you could see a shift in mode is what I think.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. I have a couple other questions here coming in from the audience here. Just a note, please put it in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but we'll try to get to them all. I'll put this out for John or Mike. How do you see disruption impacting the business of traditional truck lessors?
I actually don't have any insight into that. I don't know if you do, Mike.
Okay, I could take a swing at that one. So I think that possible disruption in that marketplace would be similar to something like what an Uber might do. Take truck leasing, for example, and take an example of what Uber does, or some of these other models where they are taking their vehicles or bicycles or those kind of models, and they set them out for short-term leases. Or they do peer-to-peer leasing. So in the traditional model of truck leasing, somebody signs up, they have to sign up for long-term leases, or they do, sort of this short-term, but it's one-to-one. So what could be a disruption in the marketplace could be either one-to-many, or many-to-many, or have pods of trucks where it could be many-to-many, so where it's non-traditional. Or you have a fleet that you've leased to somebody, but you allow them to share that cost and that fleet with a smaller fleet when their fleet is parked. So it's really, to me, you have to design it where it's really non-traditional, it's innovative, it's creative, and it's disruptive. And I think that, think of it in terms of how the Uber market might do it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer there. Next question. This would be for John, you brought this up. Can you elaborate on your suggested use of blockchain? Are there any particular transportation companies that you have seen utilizing blockchain, and what are they using it for?
Honestly, I'm just getting started in blockchain myself, and it keeps coming up in almost every conference that I go to. I do not have a specific example to share, but if you get out on the web, there are a number of articles that have been published on the topic, and there is large amounts of investment that's getting ready to pour in or is already pouring into it. In terms of practical matters, for us, we're in the point of still studying what the technology can do. We believe that the primary application, at least for now, could be in a parallel source of information to proprietary closed systems, in which multiple carriers like ocean carriers, drayage carriers, truckload carriers, railroads, and LTLs can all potentially share information securely about specific shipments without getting access to other information that is not privy to them. So we think that it has the potential in the longer term to provide a streamlined, more standardized way for individuals in the supply chain to collaborate. And I think that the long-term effect of this could potentially be, and perhaps one of the biggest areas of interest, could be in paperless customs clearance and other types of things where large numbers of actors have to come together to handle processes collaboratively. So that's our viewpoint on blockchain.
Yeah, I would just add to that, if I may, that it's really where companies are really collaborative, coming together. You might see like a technology company like IBM working with a company like Maersk. They formed a coalition so that they have a closed loop to, for instance, one of the major initiatives is the financial transactions. And the reason for that is the reason it's called blockchain is that so that nobody can access the data. You can't break into the data chain, and so the reason that they're doing it is so they have a financial transaction throughout this supply chain. And so IBM and Maersk have started a coalition, and then as other people join it, they're able to pay the supply chain invoices throughout that link.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. Next question. What do you recommend shippers and receivers do in order to expedite loading and unloading at facilities? What is your view of dock appointment setting for trucks, which means windows, grace period, parking areas, etc.? How do we get trucks in and out more quickly? So, John, we'll start with you, and I'm sure, Mike, you can help out as well.
One is, of course, moving to appointment-based programs if you don't have them. One of the biggest drivers we see of challenges is congestion in the yard, and so having too many trucks descend on you at the same time is really kind of a big part of the problem. But another is a lack of capacity for staging and receiving. And so in many cases, I think the configuration of facilities needs to be looked at, and also the allocation of labor. Another idea too is looking at moving to increased hours of operation. Many times we see facilities that run 10-hour or 12-hour days, but there's plenty of instances where you could potentially receive at other hours. And I think that plays nicely in this current market where we now have the imposition of strict hours of service laws. Being able to deal with loading and unloading at different times of day than traditional is another way to free up additional capacity in your facilities. Mike, I know you spent years and years running DCs and managing. I'm sure you've got more to add.
Yeah, I would just I think that you're spot on, and most of what I see is where a facility may lack the sophistication in labor forecasting to match the dock scheduling. So while they may schedule the loading and receiving of inbound and outbound, they do not complete the labor forecasting to match it. And so therein lies the problem. So it's a combination of forecasting, labor planning, and productivity. And if your technology allows you to do that, then you can start driving the distribution center to meet the transportation needs.
Okay, great. Great. What freights or commodities are driving truck growth in 2018? Any thoughts on that, Mike or John?
Well, certainly oil field services is one. And as oil prices climb, and like you just mentioned that we're at an all-time high since 2014, more and more money flows into areas where we're doing drilling and completions, and that tends to generate a lot of truck traffic. So that's one. And in general, we're in, I'd say, a very good consumer market. So household demand, retail goods, all those things are all showing good results at this point and driving volumes. Mike?
Yeah, I would say all of those, and I would also add automotive sector. in driving trucking, both manufacturing parts and aftermarket.
Okay. I think a very related question. What are your thoughts on trucking rates in the oil industry, specifically constrained areas like the Permian? Will truck rates rise quickly enough for companies to incentivize drivers, or are companies hesitant to get burned again in an oil market bust? I'll start with that one. We do a lot of work on the oil field and specifically a number of projects recently in the Permian. I think that this questioner here got it right. It's the balance right now, because people are afraid to go out on a limb and incentivize drivers too much to come there and raise their pay, but it is already gone up. I think the Permian is going to be very challenged because the frac sand volume has grown up, the produced water goes up with production, and of course produced products that sometimes need trucking all are going up, in addition to moving the rigs and the fleet around. So there is going to be quickly rising demand for all types of trucking in the Permian. At some point, it's going to have to raise the rates significantly, and it's going to have kind of a snowball effect, I think, from, say, East Texas or other parts of the country, as these drivers are going to be attracted by the $100,000 a year salaries and overtime costs. So I think it's really the Permian's going to cause a lot of problem outside even of its own local area, as it draws more and more truckers in from the outside. John or Mike, any comments on that?
I think you hit it on the head. I don't really have anything to add to that.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. Next question. Have you found that shippers are moving to rail from truck with the tightening truck labor market and increased freight demand?
So that from rail to truck, one of the issues that's going on right now is there's terrible congestion at the rail ramps. And a recent crisis that was just brought to my attention was issues with chassis imbalances and the inability for dray carriers to efficiently move containers. One of the situations that was brought up was, I think, in the Houston area, trying to affect rubber tire transfers, or trying to get trucks across town from one railhead to another. And so, if anything, I think people are leaving rail, if they are leaving rail, primarily because of concerns about congestion and service. But frankly, we try to advise shippers to use intermodal as much as possible. The problem that comes up with that, and it's really about saving on cost. But the issue that comes up is that as the market gets more and more constrained and capacity starts to tighten up, the spread between intermodal and over-the-road trucking rates decreases. And so you get to a point where there's diminishing returns from moving it to rail because the cost savings are not that significant. And you have the issues regarding transit time and congestion at the terminals. So I don't know. I'd call it a draw at this point. I don't think I'm seeing any particular trend in one direction or the other. Mike, any thoughts?
I would concur with that. The intermodal, it goes up and down. There was a recent report in the last, 30 to 45 days that was not very positive on the rail service. That didn't help. As the fuel costs go up, then that pushes more service to the intermodal. However, it depends on where you're shipping your freight and where it's the origin to destination is. So what kind of service you're getting. So I think, a lot of people don't like the transload A lot of people don't like perhaps the extra days that it adds on. So it depends on commodity and it depends on destination.
Okay, great. Question is, how can brokers and smaller trucking companies operating at close to a 1-to-1 truck-to-trailer ratio work past the common request of drop trailer programs? Any out-of-the-box ideas other than live load only? So Mike, you want to try that one?
Well, I think it depends on what part of the year is. I mean, during peak season, people are very reluctant to drop trailers unless you're a really big shipper with them. The capacity to drop trailers just isn't there. So I think, yes, drop trailer programs are great, but it's not really that efficient. And I think a better way to address the freight program is when you look at how we're moving freight across the country, there's like a 40% empty mileage or empty mile ratio going on. Is why do we have trucks coming in delivering freight and then somebody else picking up, and we have empty trailers going on the country? So I'm not a big fan of drop trailers. It's inefficient.
John, any comments?
No, I'll just say that one thing is that in a world where driver hours are highly constrained, drop trailers at least can reduce the amount of time spent with drivers waiting around for loading or unloading if the DC isn't very efficient. So this almost ties back to the very first point, the first questions that we were asked, which was, how do I get better throughput through my DC and handle my trucks faster? That, and to a great extent, gets rid of the need for drop trailer. And what I'd say is, if you're a carrier and you have a 1-to-1 trailer to tractor ratio, in this very market, like right this moment, it might be a time to start working with shippers to convince them that live loading is an acceptable alternative, and it's a way that they can get capacity that isn't available to them in any other way. At this moment, you actually have some leverage for that conversation. Other ways that we've seen this work is we've seen shippers invest and pay for trailer charges. I've had a number of clients over the years that have leased trailers on behalf of their carriers. And if they really need the capacity, that might be a discussion that you could have. Perhaps there's some sort of sharing arrangement of costs there.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, another way to be more efficient with live loading is if possible, is to pick up your load in non-peak times.
Okay. Next question. Based on your conversations, do you see a path to improved retention ahead of the summer months when the recent surge in heavy-duty trucks will likely come on board while carriers compete with outside work employment opportunities for drivers? So, Mike, you want to try that?
Okay. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? I apologize.
Yeah, I think that the person is asking is, could there be better retention ahead of the summer months because there are more trucks now on board? Is there a path where you see retention improving, I guess is the question.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I think, fleet companies are adding more trucks. One to deal with expected increases in volumes, but also they're trying to get nicer trucks to recruit drivers. So it's twofold. The second thing is, will it help with retention? I believe that driver retention has been a problem for 10 years. And that problem is not getting solved with nicer trucks or more trucks. That problem is going to get resolved with, if we remember the chart of driver turnover, where you had small fleet and big fleet in 63 to 95%, but LTL was 7%. LTL drivers don't have as nice of trucks as truckload does. What they have is they have better routes. So I think the answer is pay and disruption in the truckload. If truckload can change their network to be more like an LTL network, you wouldn't have turnover at 95%.
I totally agree,
So
Mike.
will that happen by summer? It will not.
No. Yeah, over the longer term, this idea of being able to get home at night, running a reasonable balance of work and lifestyle are really crucial. Another is pay, and Mike, you talked about that before. Driver pay. If the market actually wanted to solve the driver crisis, I think the problem comes in is that fundamentally there's still a lot of competition in the truckload market, and folks are reticent to raise prices enough to pay the kind of wages that are required. Even in a time of crisis right now, shippers are reticent to pay the true value of what the service would require to be reliable. And I think that's a fundamental problem with this market. How that gets fixed? Well, a couple things. One is use of relay and other types of ways to handle loads without one driver carrying it all the way through might be options for carriers. But I don't know that any of these things get fixed in the short term.
Okay, great. Well, we're coming up on time here. We want to be reticent of everyone's valuable time. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll turn it back over to Gina to wrap things up and give you some directions for next steps.